I think we should get some extra credit for putting our slides into the appropriate format. I don't see Allison here, anyone to appreciate that. What's that, you did too? All right. This is also another sucker here, I guess. This is also joint, I should say, with a student of ours who's quite good, more of a macro theorist, and he's responsible for all the stuff that's hard. There's not a lot of hard stuff in here, though. So this is, there's sort of lots of evidence, and it's very commonly known that children from poor families do a lot worse than children from better families. I think Carnero and Heckman and lots of subsequent work has shown that these gaps emerge pretty early and either persist and sometimes grow with age. But things start off very early ages. We start to see differences. So we don't have to wait till they're 20 years old to see very different outcomes for children from different family backgrounds. Give you a little bit of a sense for it. These are from I'll show you a little bit of data from the children of the NLSY. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on it. There's sort of a number of other studies that sort of will have very similar kinds of figures, so we don't claim to be providing anything particularly new here, but I just wanted to kind of frame the discussion. And this just so you can look at sort of achievement scores. This is looking at math scores by parental income quartile. These are comparisons with the lowest income quartile, where the income is a discounted present value of income over ages 0 to 7 of the kid. So over the first 7 years of life, sort of a longer run measure of lifetime income. And the blue bars show you what the differences are just in the raw data. So you see a pretty, almost a standard deviation difference between the highest and lowest income backgrounds. And these red bars show you that, if you condition on things like maternal race, AFQT, and education, indeed, this controls for all interactions of this. So this looks within an AFQT quartile, and an education group, and a racial group, how much of the effective income is left. And you see it reduces it substantially, but there's still sort of a non-trivial differences in child achievement by family income. And if you look at reading scores, reading recognition, or reading comprehension scores, you see sort of the same types of patterns. In this paper, what we want to think about is, not surprising, an investment-related story, and to the extent to which these gaps arise because of different investments that families are making at very young ages for their children. It could be from different investments or different returns on those investments in theory. This shows you from the same data, again, breaking people up by income quartiles, a number of different measures of investments. And if you know Jim's work with Flavio, these are the kinds of measures that go into the factor score that they create. And I'll show you something about those factor scores in a minute as well. And you can see across the board whether the family has lots of books in the house, whether the mom reads regularly to the child, whether the kid eats with their parents at least once a day, child leaves the house, whatever kind of measure you look at, across the board, high-income families are doing more of it than low-income families. That's at ages 2 and 3. You get the similar thing at other ages. When you get up to ages 6 or 7, you have, so there's a lot more measures in the children of the NLSY, and again you see the same type of pattern. Across the board, higher income parents are doing more of it, except for when you get over to whether you meet with family and friends very regularly. That seems to not differ very much by income. If you sort of try to create factor scores based on those different measures, we could say sort of how do those things evolve over the kids' ages. And you can see the gaps are already there at ages 0 or 1. Right off the bat, we see these pretty big gaps by family income. And they kind of go apart a little bit, come together a little bit. But for the most part, those gaps are there very young, and they kind of stay there in terms of how much parents are investing in their children. You can sort of do the same type of conditioning, look at how much of those gaps persist after you sort of condition out maternal race, AFQT, and education. Again, the same sort of type of regressions I mentioned earlier. And at ages 2 and 3, if we looked at this factor score, you could see, there's big differences in these investments by family income that I already showed you. And controlling for family background, about half of it goes away. But there's still quite a bit of difference, even sort of within these very narrow groups, in how much income over the first 7 years of a child's life is related to these outcomes or to these investments. So far what I kind of basically showed you is there's big differences, or there are differences in, there's big differences in test scores and outcome, cognitive achievements, and there's also a non-cognitive achievement, but I'm not going to show you anything on that, but there's a lot of nice work by Jim on this. There's big differences at very young ages in these achievement measures. A lot of it goes away when you condition on things like parental AFQT or education, but not all of it. And those are also in line with sort of big differences in what families are doing and the investments families are making in their children. So what we want to do in this paper is something I think fairly simple, and that is to think about different stories that people often tell that link these two sets of results that we've talked about. In particular, we want to understand or think a little bit about what role the intergenerational correlation in ability might be playing. What if there's a consumption value of schooling? That is, if parents enjoy spending time with their children, investing in them, is that an explanation for why richer parents are doing more of these investments? They just enjoy it more. Can that explain the data? Is that the explanation? We see a lot of discussion of this in thinking about college choices. Haven't seen a lot of discussion of this more at the early intervention stage. An alternative story for these gaps is just one of poor information, that either there's a lot of uncertainty in the labor market and that maybe discourages investment among lower income families, or that lower income families themselves are much more misinformed about the value of investments. And that's some work Flavio has been doing some interesting stuff on lately. That is, do poor parents just have a lot of uncertainty about the value of early investments, or do they sort of just have the wrong information about the value of early investments? We're going to explore that a little bit. And then borrowing constraints, that these may be intergenerational in the sense that poor parents may not be able to leave debts to their kid. They might want to invest in a very bright young child, but they just don't they're never going to make enough money to be able to sort of cover those costs, so they don't do it. Or they may even be life cycle in the sense that parents or children themselves would like to make investments in themselves, borrowing against future income, but they may be restricted in their ability to do so. So,
quick question, what about just the direct intergenerational transmission of like parental norms? Like parents transmit to their kids what you do as a parent.
I don't know how to think. Yeah, I don't know how to think about that. We haven't thought about that.
But there is work on that, right?
Yeah, I don't want to deny that that's
inculcating values, including.
I want to focus. I guess I want to focus today on these big gaps in investment that we see, and what can kind of explain those big gaps in investment choices families are making, and how those relate to outcomes. So there may be this other stuff. I don't want to rule out the fact that norms are maybe important, but I'm not going to explore that.
But Lance, I think some of the people, including Becker, for example, some of his last papers actually, was exactly saying there was an investment that could actually help shape the preference of the child, right? So you get the child to sort of have a sense of guilt and responsibility to you, and use that to kind of perfect markets that might be missing in the absence of well-developed credit markets.
I guess I think.
So they'd say it's a cost, so it's an investment.
It's an investment. Yeah, I guess I want to think about. I want to explain sort of how well 6-year-olds are doing, or even younger, are doing on math and reading and achievement. I suppose one could sort of argue. I guess I would think of these norms as sort of a much longer. That those aren't going to show up at such young ages. And if you're going to look at 12, 15-year-olds, then sort of instilling sort of a hard work ethic and the study, and that might be much. my thinking, this is the stuff, I'll have to think more about it, but I would think of these things as stuff that would take a lot more time than kind of the numbers I'm showing you, which are
What
sort
about
of showing up
like a
very
Confucian
early.
ethics story where you're really obedient to your parents at age 3?
Yeah, so fair enough.
Or you don't talk to your parents, or you do various other things.
Yeah, fair enough. I can think about this. We haven't thought about it yet, though. So what we're going to do is something very simple, which is to try to think about, I'm not going to show you any more data. I'm going to talk about sort of the literature, what the literature, some facts in the literature. But we want to sort of say, how can we sort amongst, there's all these scenarios or theories can generate sort of relationships between family income and child outcomes. How can we get a handle on which of these might be important, or what I don't even want to say that. I mean, which of these mechanisms can explain a wide variety of other empirical regularities? Let me put it that way. And here I'm going to summarize a little bit of evidence from the literature, what I think is the state of the literature. Some of you may disagree with certain interpretations I have. But then you can sort of, I'm going to have some red and green stuff throughout, and you can change the color in your mind as we go through. But I'm going to summarize a little bit of the evidence, and I'm going to sort of develop predictions from these different stories that would speak to either sort of that predicts results that are either consistent or conflict with or has nothing to say about that form of evidence. So I view it as a way to start sorting amongst these theories. Of course, my guess is that a lot of these things are going on simultaneously, but it gives us a sense of which of these things we might need in our model or our framework if we want to understand sort of this wide range of activities or behaviors or outcomes. Alternatively, you can view it as, if I want to model with all of this stuff in it at once, where am I going to, what sort of sources of data and would I need to see in order to sort of help me figure out how important these different pieces are? At least that's how I want to think about it.
Aldo's too polite, so I'm going to ask it. What about genotypic variation?
Yeah, so that's what I'm going to call sort of intergenerational correlation and ability. I'm going to do it in a very simple way, which is to ask whether, if we think parental income is correlated with the ability of the child, how is that going to help us understand? What will that help us understand? Extremely simple. So here's the kind of evidence I must admit I'm potentially a little biased on my views on this stuff. So the evidence that I pick, if you have other sources of evidence we should be incorporating, please raise them. But I'm going to raise sort of a few sets of evidence that I think would be interesting for a theory of understanding what's important for children, that theory we would hope could help us understand this evidence. One is, I found this interesting. I never really paid much attention to this literature until recently. It's quite fascinating. There's quite a large effect, large difference in the outcomes of firstborn children versus other-born children. That firstborn children receive more early investments and educational attainment, and they have higher cognitive achievement. There's sort of a whole spate of studies on this, a lot of very recent work looking at trying to understand that a little bit. And these differences are apparent very early, already at sort of ages 0 or 1, although not quite at birth. At birth, you don't see the gaps that you do very shortly thereafter. Here, I'm pretty sure I won't get any quarrels. The marginal returns to early investment appear to be quite high, particularly true for disadvantaged children. There's sort of a number of summaries on that. Sort of one of the nicest, cleanest example is sort of the rates of return on the Perry preschool are quite high. This I've shown you here, just the private rate of return. This is on the high end of their numbers, but I think it's the right one to think about for this. These are internal rates of return. And if you look at Cunha, I spelled that wrong, Heckman and Shanak, show
That's called the Freudians.
show that if you sort of were to, given their estimated technology, what's the right way to allocate funds to investing in kids, and it should be to spend more on young disadvantaged children at young ages. Again, consistent with the idea that their marginal returns to investment are quite high at these young ages, and that's particularly true for more disadvantaged children.
I thought we saw a lot of high returns in to late investments. Like the papers by Bruce Seiserot, Philaropoulos.
I don't want to, at this point, I'm not going to take a stand on that. It doesn't matter for what I want to talk about today. That may be true. I'm not saying they're higher at young ages or lower, just that they're high. In some sense, high relative to the return on savings one would expect, and that they may be higher for poor kids relative to rich kids. That's the only.
Those kinds of studies, I think, are more like providing information, though, right? They're giving information. They're not quite the same as thinking about a skill. I mean, it's a skill, a certain kind of knowledge. It's very right at a key moment of choice, like college and going.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could find investments in older kids that are productive, and then you could find lots that are not particularly productive. And
ask you a quick question.
Yep.
In the previous slide, are you saying that differences are apparent very early, but not at birth? But not at birth, you mean that we cannot detect them?
well, at birth, when they do like these APGAR scores or birth weight or height, you don't see any differences. It actually favors firstborn relative to, or no, it favors later kids relative to firstborn by a small margin.
But the dimension of those measurements are slightly different from, for example, from the measurements that you're using.
Yeah. No, fair enough. I was going to say there's no real evidence that these are big birth advantages. It could be, and we just don't measure that properly. But the measurements we have at birth don't seem to suggest that these gaps are there. You know, the firstborn are much healthier in any sense.
But they're not cognitive measures. Is that
They're not
that's the
cognitive
point,
measures.
right?
No, that's true. That's true. I also want to argue that the best evidence out there by Magne and others suggests that exogenous increases in income actually improve child outcomes. Not that there's not just only a correlation between child outcomes and parental income, but actually changing families' income improves how well children do on test scores. This is I think Magne's stuff and our stuff suggests, my work with Gordon suggests that the effects appear to be a bit larger for more disadvantaged children, although that's sort of less. It's harder to pin down. So a nice recent paper by Milligan and Stabile. Actually, it's not even a paper yet. It's more a presentation I saw, and the slides. Very related sort of strategy to what they did, looking at increases in the child benefit in Canada, shows they're actually looking at how families spend money, and they show increases in educational expenditures associated with increases in exogenous increases in income, suggesting a link. Actually, there is at least some link between money and how much people spend on their investments. Carniero and Ginja have a very interesting paper showing that, sort of trying to link up with this consumption literature, that estimating sort of transitory and permanent shocks to the earnings process, and show that permanent shocks are correlated with investments, various investment measures as well. And then Cunha, Heckman, and Shanak show in an appendix table that income has an important effect on investments over ages 1 to 14. The last is probably the most controversial, but I want to lay it out there, and I defend it, which is that early income appears to be more important at earlier ages than at later ages. And that's true when you look at achievement, look at these sort of PIAT scores, the math and reading scores, a variety of different ways we've looked at that, or when you look at sort of at least college attendance. Now, Carniero and Heckman in their paper did not find significant effects on college attendance. Our update of that, I think, we basically have doubled the sample, so I think we're able to sort of identify effects with just more precision. But we find that earlier income, once you appropriately discount income using sort of reasonable interest rates, actually high interest rates relative to some of the literature, that earlier income is more important than late income. So now what I want to do is think about, so that's sort of the body of evidence I want to think about, and I want to think about what do my models have to say about these types of predictions, and are they consistent with them? So I'm going to focus on these different mechanisms and look at these kind of outcomes: investment behavior, marginal returns on investments, human capital outcomes, and how investment or human capital outcomes might respond to changes in income. I'll talk a little bit about the role of dynamic complementarity, although it's kind of in the background in a lot of what we're doing. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that today. But that's sort of the fact that investments at an early age may be complementary with investments at later ages. And I'm going to sort of kind of try and compare what we get out of the models to what the results I've talked about. So we're going to try to do this all within sort of one kind of basic framework, although we're going to shut down pieces at a time to focus on each of these sort of parts at once. But we kind of want one overarching framework to look at all this within. So we're going to have a model with 3 stages of life. There's an early childhood stage where you make early investments and consumption. There's a late childhood period, think of this as sort of later schooling ages, where you also continue to make investments and consume. And then there's an adulthood period that's not going to be very interesting for most of what I'm talking about, except for that's when you're going to get your earnings and you're going to consume. Standard utility function, discount rate beta. I'm going to call it parental income, Y1 and Y2. I'll come back to that in a second. Sort of parental income in the first period of the child's life and the second period of the child's life. Prices on human capital. Investments are going to be P1 and P2, although they're not going to play an important role in what I talk about. When we think about the consumption value of investing, we could think about this sort of nu times I. I'll show you the problem in a second, but that sort of taste for investment, it could be positive or negative. You could enjoy spending time reading with your kid, or you could not enjoy it. And then there's sort of a gross rate of return on assets, which I'm just going to set to the inverse of the discount rate. So people want sort of smooth consumption profiles. That's not very important at all. So at the end of it, so you're going to make some early investment. When it's a scalar, when there's only one type of investment, we're going to have H2 as just your early investment. That's your sort of think of that as your human capital or your total investment after the first period. We're going to sort of also talk about cases where there might be multiple things you could do in terms of investment. And then your human capital, when you're done, when you enter the labor market and you work, is just theta times some function of your early investment and your late investment. And theta we think of as ability, and then the sort of standard assumptions on the production function. So here's what the problem is. Very simple. We're going to maximize my expected value of discounted lifetime utility, where I've got my consumption in here. Here's my sort of utility cost potentially of investing in my children. I don't have utility value of second period investment, although that would be easy enough to add. We're mostly focused on what's going on in the earlier phases of life. And then there's some value function once you become an adult. For a lot of what I'm going to talk about, this is just going to be there's going to be 3 periods, and it's utility of your consumption in that period. But for when we get to borrowing constraints, we'll talk about how that might future borrowing constraints might create some differences there. Your budget constraints, you basically have some savings that you get to spend. You get some parental income or income. You spend it on investment and consumption. Let's see. The way we've written it is it's a simple life cycle problem. This maps directly into sort of an intergenerational problem if you want. We've done that we're doing that elsewhere. If it helps you, you could just think about this as utility of the family's consumption with the young kid as part of the family. And then the family this is the continuation value of that family once the kid grows up, if that helps you. So that, by interpretation then, is going to be when I think about Y1 and Y2, I want to think about those as family income. Yep.
What is the expectation with respect to income and theta?
Well, it's going to vary. Most of it's going to be, it's not going to depend, there's going to be no uncertainty, but when I have explicit discussion of different forms of uncertainty and information, where then I'll be clear. And then I'm going to define the discounted present value of family income as just the discounted present value of Y1 and Y2. So then all I'm going to do now is sort of go through different features of this basic framework and focus on them and say, what do we learn from them? So first, intergenerational ability correlation. By that, I want to operationalize it by basically saying, let's think about a world where parental income is correlated with the kid's ability theta. And then I'm going to ask, this is sort of an unobserved correlation kind of story. It says, how does ability affect sort of what we're looking at? So we think of kids from rich families are more able than kids from poor families. What does that tell us about what kind of allocations we should have?
So is there a link between the theta in one generation and the theta in the other?
Yeah, I mean here I'm not even talking about the other generation. The link is really through Y.
Through Y.
So it's the higher. So I think of it as
But
exactly that
in principle,
way.
there could be another covariance between, like the earlier papers today, like in Becker and Tomes.
Yeah. So I think of this as being driven by exactly that. There's some latent ability of the parent, theta, prime, and that's correlated with their income, which happens to be correlated with theta.
The theta is how different you learn in the second.
First and second period. It's your marginal product.
It's only a bit, right?
It affects the productivity of your total.
So, but I thought that the
investment.
critical thing was how theta is compared to 1 because it's how much? Yeah, it's H2 versus H3 now.
I'm going to be mostly interested in, well, theta here is, so think of this as just early investment and late investment. So theta is going to tell you the productivity of all of your investments. I'll show you a little bit later. We can add sort of differences in.
Producing H3. He's right.
What's that?
I mean, theta is not directly affecting the productivity of H2.
I mean, it looks like that if theta
Right.
is less than 1, you're saying
Well, theta-
the effect on the second period is smaller than in the first.
Yeah,
Or
excellent.
vice versa.
What? No. Theta just is like a TFP, something like that. Think of this as
Since
I1.
it doesn't appear in the first period, I thought that.
Oh, well, the first period.
In the first
Oh, I mean,
period.
the first period, you're invested. All you care about is your human capital at the end. Your human capital in the middle doesn't matter for anything except for the fact that it's going to affect. You don't get any payoff to H2. Does that make sense?
But it still
No.
could affect the productivity. I mean, it's not a big point, I think, but it still could affect the productivity, the differential productivity.
Oh, I mean, you could put
I1
it. Yeah, I
versus
mean,
I2, right?
so you want.
Yeah, just put it outside or as an argument of the first period, right? Production.
You could allow. We don't, but you could allow theta. Here, theta has the same effect on the marginal return to early investment as it does on late investment. We could allow for it to have a bigger effect on early or a bigger effect on late. We're not doing that. I'll show you a little bit where we'll have something that generates a wedge between those. But for now, here theta is just your ability to translate all of your investments into some human capital at the end. I see your point. So here we're going to sort of just sit. We're going to abstract from everything else, assume no tastes. We've got a scalar on investment. Think about a 3-period model. So in the last period, you just consume your income from your income from human capital plus any savings that you have. There's no borrowing constraints anywhere in sight. I mean, this isn't going to be terribly surprising. I just really want to make one point out of this model, which is that the marginal return on investments for everyone equals the return on savings in this world. So I'll get back to that in a second. But and obviously, investments in human capital are going to be increasing in ability. And investments in marginal return don't themselves depend on the stream of income in any way. So if we think about, what does this tell, if we want to sort of map this and sort of think about what does it tell us we should see in the data, well, certainly a positive correlation between parental income and kids' ability is going to generate a positive relationship or positive correlation between investments, human capital, and wages of the children. and the discounted present value of parental income. So, I mean, that's sort of the motivating force. But what else can the model deliver? Well, the timing of income is only going to be relevant to the extent that that tells us something additional about ability. If we think ability is positively correlated with income growth, which it tends to be, then we'd actually, this would suggest that parental income, early parental income should be less correlated with child investments in human capital than late income, which is sort of red because that doesn't sort of fit the facts.
Lance, this may just be an aesthetic matter, and skip it. I mean, it's kind of as putting an assumption of an endogenous variable and an exogenous variable as a primitive seems not so appealing. So think about the overlapping generations context. Presumably what you would do is you would put in a process for theta, and then along the equilibrium path that would entail a certain correlation structure. I mention it really just in case there's some implicit restrictions on preference. They may not be interesting restrictions, but
I don't think here.
no, Y is my problem. I'm worried about Y.
Isn't Y exogenous?
Why is exogenous to the kid?
No,
Why is
but-
this the
but
parent's family income?
No, but I have a stochastic process called adult incomes, and another stochastic process called abilities. I
I
think
mean,
of
the
the one.
intergenerational.
Yeah, the intergenerational version.
Yeah, that's kind of being
Then,
subsumed here.
yeah, then it would be placing a restriction on the relationship between the endogenous variable and something you said is exogenous. As I said, it maybe just an aesthetic.
Yeah, for what I guess for our purpose, for what we want to do, all I want to do is say, well, one of the explanations for why poor kids get less investment and have less human capital than rich kids is because poor kids are of lower ability. That's all I want to do. And all I want to say is, so what I want to say is, well, if that's your story, it still suggests that the marginal return should be the return on savings for everybody. Even if they're high ability, they should be doing more investment up to the point where the marginal return is equated to the return on savings. And it should be that marginal return should be unrelated to parental income and ability. So this notion that the returns to early investments are high, particularly for poor children, can't be explained by this simple fact alone. It's also sort of not consistent with this sort of story. It can't help us understand why exogenous changes in income affect human capital. It's like the admitted variable problem, essentially. That's all I want to say. I don't want to make, this is not a big point. This one's not, the more interesting points are going to be the information and constraint stories.
Can I just clarify? There are two different notions here. One is sort of the rate of return to the child. And by assumption, every child has got the same rate of return because of the perfect credit market. And
Right.
the other is the amount of investment in
Yep.
the child.
And that'll be higher.
That'll be higher.
Higher for poor kids. Higher for rich kids.
Higher for
Exactly. It gets
Well,
higher precisely to the point that
for
it.
both, but for higher theta and for higher y, both increasing, right?
Well, it's not. It's only increasing in y because of theta is related to y. It's not increasing in y here without credit constraints otherwise.
Oh, right. Because
Right.
you can borrow.
Right.
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 I understand.
Yeah. So income itself has no
Expenditure,
causal.
I meant, not income.
No causal effect of income here. It's
Correct.
just a pure
Yeah.
spurious correlation. Which that's sort of there's nothing new there. I don't want to make a big point of that. What if a consumption value? Suppose there's this consumption value in there. We called it new. That people get just direct utility potentially, or direct utility costs or benefits from investing in their children. Keep all the other assumptions just what we have, but now add that in. Now you can see you get a wedge between the marginal return on human capital and the rate of return on savings, precisely because you enjoy doing it or you dislike doing it. For the second period, there's no wedge, although if we added a taste for second period investing in old kids, you could get a wedge there as well. What does it mean? Well, marginal return on early investments is going to be strictly less than the return on savings if people enjoy spending time investing in their children. And it's going to be strictly decreasing in the family income. Here you'll get income, early investments and final human capital levels increasing in family income. And late investments will also be increasing in family income as long as you've got sort of gross complementarity. Not surprisingly, if you sort of spending time with your kids is costly, if you really hate reading to your kid, you get everything on here is the opposite. So what is it, thinking about the data, Suppose everybody enjoys spending time with their kids. Well, this can give us sort of positive effects of parental income on child investments, test scores, and education. You're going to, higher income people are going to buy more of it. It also gives you a higher marginal return on early investments for poor children, but it suggests that the marginal return is below the return on savings for everyone. It's just that poor children are closer to this return on savings. But rich parents are going to have a really low return. And again, the timing of income is irrelevant in this sort of scenario. So maybe you're sort of saying, well, maybe there's heterogeneity. Maybe rich parents like spending time investing and teaching their kid to read, and poor parents don't. Well, if you're sort of willing to assume that, you can get sort of a high marginal return on investment for poor kids in that scenario, and as well as low investment in poor kids. So that's good. Problem is, you sort of run up against this problem where now that implies if you give poor families more money, they're going to spend less investing in their kid because they don't like doing it. And now they don't have to. They can afford not to, which is counterfactual. Again, timing of income is sort of not going to be relevant.
But you have evidence. Why should there be association between the income of the family and the sign of new?
Oh, it's coming right off of this, off the first order condition, that if I enjoy spending time with my kid, I'm going to do more of it, and rich parents can afford to do more of it. It's like a normal good in that world. So they do more of it. But because they enjoy doing it, they're going to do it beyond the point where it pays off financially. So that's the sense in which you get a low marginal return in the labor market for it. It's going to look like a really low return for those guys. So everybody gets a lower return than the return on savings. Yeah?
I just have a general question. Like, you only have 3 periods, but don't you automatically have a natural borrowing limit? Like, are you allowing negative consumption in period 3? Because I think if you do, then your second implication would be that they will spend less in terms of the second red implication on the bottom for the low-income family on the next slide.
Well, here I don't have any borrowing constraints.
No, but you implicitly would have it in a time, in a even in an infinite horizon, you do have a live within your mean constraint, right?
Yeah, that's in here. I mean, you as long as you can borrow against all that future income you get from your human capital investment.
But I can't have like in if my marginal return on early investment is so high that I would like to spend more than Y1 plus Y2, I can clearly not do that. Right?
Well, I could spend more than Y1 plus Y2, but I can't spend more than Y1 plus Y2 plus theta F of plus my future earnings.
So I do have.
So I have a budget constraint. I have a budget constraint. Yeah, that's fine.
Then in this case, doesn't mean that if you go forward one set of laws, the negative effect on parental income on the argument that the low-income families, if you give them money, they would spend less in terms of the share of the life cycle income, not necessarily in terms of the investment would still increase because the life cycle income has increased, but in terms of share of life cycle income, they would spend less because you are reducing.
No, here if you don't like investing in if it's costly to invest in your kids, you're sort of doing it because it pays. You're doing it because it pays, and it has to pay enough to compensate you for the fact that you don't like doing it. It pays in the sense that your kid's going to do well in life. But I hate reading to my kid, but I do it because he's going to earn more later on in life. And if I get more money, then that's less valuable to me, so I'm going to do less of it. That's what this point basically says.
Yeah, my question is that at the same time, my constraint is less strict because I get the wealth effect.
There's no wealth of... Well,
there is.
There's a lifetime wealth effect, but this dominates. I mean, you could show that this dominates. You're right. There may be this opposing wealth. Essentially, it's a denominator. This thing's changing as well, but you can show that it's the sign is right.
One question. What about the opportunity cost of these higher income parents?
The opportunity cost of what?
Well, I mean, the opportunity cost of not working less, for instance. To be
of
able
the parents,
to,
you mean? Or?
Yeah. Because they have a lot of they love to read with their children, but probably will need to sacrifice some labor time. So it's an opportunity cost that maybe higher.
Yeah, so there, I mean, that's one thing. I mean, here we're assuming implicitly the price of investment is the same for everyone. There's essentially you could get this nice neutrality result that it comes out of sort of a Ben Parath model. People are more aware of it in that context than this one. But if parents' time investing in their kids is proportionally more productive, if the value of their time is in proportion to the value of their time in the labor market, so parents that earn more in the labor market, also when they spend time investing in their kids, they get sort of more, their kids get more out of that time. As long as the parent's human capital is equally productive in the labor market as it is for kids, then that sort of washes out.
But at least
It's
for
only if
mother's
the parents.
education, that's
What's
not-
that?
But at least for mother's education, the evidence is pretty much against that. Home productivity versus market, not necessarily on the kids, right? I'm just thinking of all the body of work on sort of negative selection. You know, who goes into the workforce? Typically the argument. Anyway, it's just
Yeah.
It's not directly productivity of children, though. It's just all home production.
Yeah. In terms of kids, I don't know if we know the answer to that. It's an important question.
Well, Flynn, Boca, you could put explicitly time in the model.
You could put I mean, you could essentially
the
make
wage
the
of the
price of the parents. The price of investing could be higher or lower for rich families. Right now, we're assuming it's the same, and that's like I say, it's if you think time investments are the key thing, then as long as sort of the parents' human capital in the labor market what is equally productive in producing kids, then you're fine. It's equivalent to just ignoring it. On the other hand, if you think they're sort of they're more productive or less productive, then so if I'm twice as productive in the labor market, my investments in my kid are twice as productive. As long as that holds, this is fine. As soon as you go away from that,
I have a hard time thinking that's
and I don't know which way it
for
goes.
reading, for instance.
What's that?
I have a hard time thinking that that's going to be true for reading to your kids, for instance, right? I mean, as long as you have a minimum level of reading capacity and empathy.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know, to be honest.
A high-end lawyer and a low-end lawyer reading to their kids, and the high-end lawyer sacrificing. I mean, I don't see any reason to assume that.
But they're highly educated and they can
Both of
have
them.
more strategy, and they could be more productive at reading to the kid because they're more productive in the market. And,
I mean, I don't have a. I mean, I don't think we know the answer to that. Obviously, you could move it around and you could get. I think a little bit more about it. We've got a sort of a neutral. We've got a neutrality assumption here, though.
But in his case, you could have possibly good market substitutes, right? So the opportunity cost is high. That's not built in quite yet in the model, right? So I could switch. If I'm really a high-income lawyer, I could hire a perfectly good nanny, a PhD in child psychology.
Yeah.
You want the kid to come out healthy.
Maybe your kid is going to resent your absence, and then his productivity is going to be lower. I don't think
Then
it's
you hire
perfectly
two nannies, a very warm one and a very sorry.
Yeah, I mean that's one solution to the problem. If you don't like spending time with your kids, you pay someone else to do it.
Right, exactly.
I
Could
haven't
you
thought
also
about
figure
that.
out, though, that there are ways to do two tasks at once while you're changing the diaper you're reading to the kid? And you'd be motivated to do that if you're
high
valuing
income.
your time as high.
I mean, it's true that higher income parents tend to spend more time with their kids. High wage women or women that work more often even spend more time with their kid. So, I mean, I think a little bit more about that. I think it's going to. I mean, you're still going to get this effect that a causal change in income is going to do this. I'm not sure. I have to think about whether it solves any of the other sort of turns anything else red to green. That I'd have to think more about. What I think is so. Let's see. I'm getting to what I think is the more interesting stuff now. I'm running out of time. I want to think about what I call confusion. This is going to be sort of a few different stories. I want to think about two ways parents might be confused. Actually, it's kind of three, to be honest. But one is about a sort of subjective uncertainty. That is, I may have some uncertainty about the value of my investments. The first case I'm going to consider is just everybody has equal uncertainty and there's risk aversion. Kind of a classical kind of case. The second case I'm going to explore is where poor parents may have more uncertainty about the value, the productivity of early investments than do rich kids. And I'm going to ask, what is the role, even if families are risk neutral, what role does uncertainty about the productivity of investments play? And then I'm going to ask a sort of a separate set of questions is, suppose parents just have the wrong beliefs. There's no uncertainty. They just think they've got the wrong beliefs on how productive different investments are. There might be lots of investment activities, and I don't know whether I should be reading to my kid, I should be playing blocks with them, or playing baseball with them. There's all these things I could do, and I don't know how productive those different things are. What role, how does that affect investment behavior? And how does that affect human capital outcomes in the end? So I want to think a little bit about that. In this model where we have early and late investments, there's kind of some very interesting stuff about substitutability and complementarity that play a role that I'm not going to have time to talk much about, but I think are kind of interesting. And here I'm going to shut down this consumption value stuff and assume sort of still continue to stick with this kind of 3-period framework.
So in the multi-period framework, you're talking about learning? So you learn something about the first period and then
Yeah,
as a
so
result,
yeah, I'll be really explicit in a second.
Okay, okay.
Um,
No, I was just wondering if that's what you were abstracting from, because that would be very
Yeah, in the early stuff I was abstracting from that entirely. I'm kind of trying to focus on each of the different mechanisms by themselves. Obviously, they may all play a role together. They're probably all partly relevant. I want to think about what each of the different mechanisms does on its own. So here I'm going to just start off with theta being uncertain. And people are risk averse, and you don't find out theta until after you're done making all your investments. And here that could be labor market uncertainty about the returns to skill, or you don't know about your kid's ability, and there's going to be sort of no insurance markets here. So you make these investments and you have to live with them. You can see, because you don't observe your theta till the end, there's not going to be really any distortion between I1 and I2, but the overall level might be distorted. And you can define sort of an indirect production function that looks at how your production of your human capital is going to depend on total expenditures. This H of E, where E reflects the total expenditures on investment. And you could sort of show, fairly, this is very standard stuff with risk aversion. You're going to get kind of, let me just go down here. You're essentially going to get a wedge between the marginal return on investment and the return on savings, because of in states where you happen to get a good realization, you have a low marginal utility of consumption because you can't insure against it. So what does that mean? Well, your expected marginal return on early investments is going to exceed the return on savings. Same with late investments as well. You get underinvestment basically due to the uninsurable risk here. Investment is going to be increasing in parental income as long as you have decreasing absolute risk aversion. Of course, the way I've written it here, where you learn everything at the end, the timing of income is still going to be irrelevant. Did I just skip? Oh, no. Let me think. So I'll come back to sort of summarizing.
I mean, this is just a trivial remark, really, but if there was enough sort of convexity in the technology, if you really learned, suppose you thought there's like the 2-point distribution on theta, so your kid could be a genius, so there's this high hope that you have the new Mozart or the new Einstein, versus now you can get an enormously high payoff, right? Then the uncertainty might cause you to invest more in that framework, could it not? I'm talking about just a difference in concave.
Not here. I mean, the key is whether that you have concavity in the function with respect to investments. Now, I suppose if you had,
no, I'm thinking about entering.
If you brought theta inside there in different ways.
Yeah. So this makes it like a fundamental.
Yeah, then maybe.
So there's a really high payoff.
Yeah, I'd have to think more about that. You might be right, because then, yeah, you're going to get a sort of a different. This is going to be kind of the marginal value of early or late investment up here, how that varies with theta. Yeah, so you maybe I'll have to think about that.
You always have inefficient investment, right?
What's that?
You always be discounting.
You're always,
returns.
yeah, you're gonna.
Either way,
Jim's got
it might be
in mind
over
that
investing.
situation where you're
You're still gonna get that wedge.
Yeah.
You're still gonna get a wedge. It's gonna be a different wedge.
It's going to be a different wedge.
Yeah.
I'm saying, but I'm talking about the investment.
The investment
Yeah,
can go
yeah.
up if the mean return.
I don't think you're going to be able to turn this positive, though. I would be surprised if that were the case. I'm pretty sure it's always going to be negative, because in high states where you're lucky, you're going to have too much consumption. So I think that result's still. I think you're still going to get underinvested.
The comparative static, though, the comparative static is more risk that might come along with higher mean outcomes, right? I think, and that would then lead to greater investment, although it wouldn't be.
I see. Yeah, I want to
level.
think about mean preserving.
Inequality.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking about mean
Preserving spread in
spreads.
second, so then you'd get the,
Yeah.
the classic
Yeah.
third, depending on the third
Yeah,
derivative,
yeah.
utility.
It's like Walter Roy's own result.
So the other case on uncertainty I want to think about is now, let's suppose there's some productivity of value on early investment. So now we're going to enter this this W in here, and people are going to have beliefs about it, and we want to think about, different people have some uncertainty. There's a truth. The truth is W, but they have some beliefs about it that are unbiased but maybe uncertain. And people are going to learn this after they make their investment. So this is kind of, I got to make, I don't know what to, I don't know how productive, think of Flavio's paper. I don't know how productive it is. Well, he's got kind of he's closer to the next one, but I don't know how productive it is to read to my kids. On average, I'm right, but there's a lot of uncertainty about it. And I'll find out, when he's 7 years old, I'll find out whether it was productive or not. But I don't know. And so I know it by the time I get to invest later, when I'm deciding whether to send him to college or not. But I don't know it when I'm making these early investments. And here, to shut down the risk aversion stuff, to show you can get some interesting stuff purely off the technology, let's assume linear preferences. You're going to get kind of the expected marginal return on investment equal to the rate of return on savings. But this is sort of the expectation. The truth is going to turn out to be that you have a high return. What you could show pretty easily is that, and this is sort of Jensen's inequality kind of result, is that a mean preserving spread in these beliefs is going to reduce early investment as long as sort of the marginal returns are concave in these beliefs. So what generates that? Well, that's a bit of we could show, I think this is a bit stronger than it needs to be, but we could show that as long as you sort of the elasticity of substitution between early and late investments, if they're substitutable enough, you can get this result. I think we can weaken this because this is actually pretty strong. The estimates tend to suggest closer to 1/2 that wouldn't satisfy this. But this is kind of a weak statement here, and this is a weak statement. So pretty sure more reasonable parameterizations can deliver this result. So with underinvestment, you're going to have sort of a high marginal return on the last investment you make, and you can also get lower late investments as long as you have growth complementarity. But again, notice there's no sort of direct effect of parental income here, unless you think giving someone an extra $1,000 suddenly reduces their uncertainty about it. And I imagine one might be able to tell stories about that, although one wouldn't think sort of you'd think that would sort of be a longer run kind of story where, well, someone gets wealthy, they move to a better neighborhood, eventually sort of they figure out, well, maybe I should be doing this with my kids because everybody else is doing something different. It's hard to think of sort of this as sort of a direct effect of income. Think of it more as sort of, instead, if we could provide more information for families, we could sort of get their investment moved up. But it's hard to tell easy stories about why sort of just giving them more money would solve that problem. And
Unless the
lastly,
information can be purchased as a marketplace.
yeah, so it's an interesting possibility. Yeah, so I mean, in theory, that's
I buy
right.
an expert.
Yeah. No, I think that, in theory, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, that has to be true. The last sort of information kind of story I want to think about is one where there's a bunch of investments I can make, all with different prices, although you can really ignore the different prices for now. But then there's some sort of CES aggregator or Dixit-Stiglitz kind of story where all those investments get aggregated in this CES way in order to produce sort of my H2 that's going to show up then and affect the marginal return to late investments. Well, you can sort of use the standard results and sort of derive an implicit price of that total investment bundle H2. Q has this structure. What you can see sort of immediately out of this is, so we want to think about a world where people don't know what this W is. We're not going to think about uncertainty about it, but they just have the wrong beliefs about this. So I don't know. Different people have different views on how productive reading versus doing math problems with your kid is, and how does that factor into investment behavior. Well, the first thing so I'm going to call W tilde what they think is the truth and what they act on in making their decisions. Well, it's very clear that if you can move W around, as long as you hold Q constant, it's not going to have any effect on total expenditures. It just means you're going to spend on the wrong stuff. So you're going to get less out of it. You'll spend the same amount, but you get less human capital at the end. And that's just sort of a direct result of the definition of maximization. If you're kind of maximizing the wrong function, you're not going to get as much out as if you maximize the right one. Investment's going to be lower if sort of this implicit price is high. And then you can sort of generate lower levels of human capital as a result. It's really hard to say anything in this general case of what happens to the marginal return on expenditures, because on the one hand, doing the wrong thing, you get less you get less H2, less total investment out of it. So that sort of tends to make the marginal return of $1 of investment high. On the other hand, you've got the wrong beliefs, so you're doing the wrong thing. So that makes it low. And these things, it's not, in general, it's not, you can't sort of say which one dominates without putting a little bit more structure on it. One way to do it is, well, just assume everybody has downward belief on everything, proportional. So they think everything is less productive than it is. I think if this is sort of closer to what Flavio is talking about in his stuff. Although I don't know that he's kind of looked that widely across activities. That would be interesting, I think. You could show in this case you're going to get less total investment out, less early investments of all types, and you're going to have a high marginal return then on your investments. And then the last case is, suppose I think about two types of activities, and I want to hold kind of the average productivities of those constant, but think about I could screw up which one's more important or less important. So we can make some normalizations that suppose the prices are the same, and suppose the investment in type 1 is less productive than type 2. You actually end up with a world where if your beliefs are right on the truth, you invest exactly what you should in the right amount. On the other hand, if your beliefs about that low productivity event, if you think it's even less productive, it turns out your total expenditures on human capital investment are higher than they would be under the truth. So if I provided this guy with the correct information, he'd actually spend less money. He might get more out of it because he's doing the right thing instead of the wrong thing, but he'd actually spend less. On the other hand, if he kind of has an overestimate and you move him in the right direction, then he's going to invest more and be more productive. And you can see you get this kind of U-shaped way over here. This is the exact opposite where I flip sign. I get exactly, I think I get the right sort of ratios of productivity. One's a quarter and one's 3/4, but I got them flipped on the wrong activities. I would spend the same amount of money, but I would just get a lot less out of it because I'm doing the wrong stuff. Turns out you can even show in an example, we've only sort of worked out one example, but not really more general cases. But you can actually get lower levels of final human capital out of this with providing better information. It's possible that in some sense, being way up here might lead to more human capital than if I put the guy in the right spot. And that sort of tends to be, you could get that if you've got sort of investments similarly productive and fairly substitutable. So it kind of doesn't matter that much which one you do. Then if you sort of make a big mistake and you think one of them is really productive, it turns out you can get that your sort of under investment in one activity is dominated by your over investment in the other. So there are cases in which you can derive cases, how sort of rare those are, we haven't quite figured out yet, but where sort of providing more information might actually lead to less investment expenditure and lower human capital outcomes. So the presumption that you're always worse off because you're uninformed is not necessarily true. How do these, let me skip over this a little bit. I'll come back at the very end about how these all line up with the facts, because I'm running out of time here. And I want to say a little bit about borrowing constraints. And that is, now think of a case where we get rid of our uncertainty part. We have no consumption value, but now people may not be able to borrow as much as they want. Let me skip over this. This value function now reflects the sort of the value of some sort of life cycle problem thereafter. If you're never constrained ever again in the future after you're an adult, you can sort of write that as a function of your total wealth, your assets that you've saved, and then the total value of your human capital over the rest of your life, if none of those constraints bind. But we don't necessarily need to assume that. What do you get out of this world? Well, now there may be a wedge between, you may not be able to sort of equate marginal utilities of consumption. That's what to be constrained means. You equate the marginal value of investment now to the marginal value of consumption in that period. So you can actually, if you're unconstrained, you're equating the marginal return to the return on savings. On the other hand, if you're borrowing constraint in that period or forever, any time in the future, if you had uncertainty, if you ever might be borrowing constrained, you're going to have a sort of a high marginal return relative to the return on savings. What about changing income? Well, if the early borrowing constraint when you're young, when your kids are young, if that doesn't bind, then all that matters is the discounted present value of lifetime income. On the other hand, if the early borrowing constraint binds, so if families are constrained when their kids are young, now the timing of income actually matters. And you could show that early investment is always increasing in early family income. It's not surprising. Maybe perhaps more surprising is that if you're only constrained when you're young, not when you're older, then actually increasing income for that family when the kid's older reduces early investments in human capital.
How do you get the birth order effects there?
Well, I mean,
talking about that in the beginning, we never.
Yeah, I come to that. Yeah, I kind of skipped over that in the story. I'll come to that. And if both constraints bind, then you can get investments increasing in early and late income as long as you have enough complementarity between those investments. If they're very substitutable, then increasing income in one period is going to tend to lead to more investment in that period and away from investment in the other period. So if you have enough complementarity, you're going to sort of do both together. They're going to move together. So here I'll tell both birth order. So you can explain sort of the poor should make lower early investments and late investments. They should have a high marginal return on their investments relative to the return on savings, as well as relative to the return for the rich. Increases in family income should increase investments. In order to explain sort of an asymmetric response, a bigger response to early income than late income, you must have early constraints have to bind. And I didn't sort of talk about this result, but you see it that late investments are also increasing in early income and late income. So college attendance increases in both early and late income. In order to get that, you actually need strong complementarity as well as constraints binding at both of these ages. But then if you kind of have that condition, you can sort of get all these facts right. What about birth order? On the one hand, family income tends to increase over time, so that would suggest second kids should do better than first ones. On the other hand, if you think resources get more scarce as you add more kids to the family, that might sort of benefit the first kid. So it's not a clear prediction here.
I thought the fact was holding family size constant, there are birth order effects.
What's that?
I thought the fact was so if you hold family effects constant, so fixing family size,
Yep.
then there still are birth order effects.
Yeah, but I mean the first kid has 2, 3, 4 years when he's the only one around, and the second kid doesn't. So depending, you have these opposing effects. You'd expect maybe families with very flat income profiles this to dominate. Families with very steep profiles, it's possible that the second kid could do better. So one could look at that. I haven't seen the birth order effect look too much at that, which I've started to try to look at it in the data, but I haven't gotten very far yet. So I'm hoping to bring some evidence that might kind of tell us how important each of these might be.
But Lance, let me just go back right here. Yeah, the notion of borrowing constraint here is kind of now like a lower limit on on the amount of loans. But what if we thought about borrowing constraint in terms of the rate of payment, the terms of credit? So
Yeah, you get something
the
similar.
interest rate
If the interest rate is if it's an increasing function of,
like parents'
say, how much you want to
ability
borrow, you'll get something very similar.
or measures of parents' ability or parents' wealth or some other notion.
Yeah,
I'm
you get
just trying
something
to
very
think of-
similar.
Is it
I
the
mean,
same?
Yeah, it's essentially, I mean, here the Lagrange multiplier on how much it's binding is playing the same role as like a high interest rate.
Yeah,
So
but
they
that-
turn
but
out to
that-
be almost identical predictions.
But I'm just thinking there are lots of different ways to model what we mean by an imperfect market. And I'm not sure they all have the same implications for policy.
For these kind of things, in terms of the
I understand in
marginal
terms of the
investment, marginal
Lagrange.
returns, and these points,
That I understand.
it's going to be the same. I don't.
But like the notion of suppose that my borrowing is partly constrained on the basis of my education, okay, or some expected future income. So an income transfer to a poor parent wouldn't have much of an effect per se on that, as opposed to say a change in the interest rate or renegotiation with the bank. So that, I'm just trying to get at the notion of what. some of these income effects are.
that may be true.
So I mean, I'm just saying there are multiple definitions of what we mean.
Sure. I mean, I tend to think. I mean, I've played around with this stuff a lot, and not so much lately. But earlier on, this was always kind of an easier way for me to operationalize borrowing constraints. But you could sort of say, let's make the interest rate a function of how much you want to borrow. More exogenously, assume some people face a high interest rate and others a low. You're going to get out some like rich people face a lower interest rate than poor people. You're going to get out kind of the exact same type of conclusions here. There may be other conclusions that I'm not talking about that would depend on that. I mean, certainly I'm not one to say it's not interesting to think about where those borrowing constraints come
But there
from.
would
I
be
spent a lot of
very
time thinking
strong
about
force
that.
here, right? Which would be towards postponing your children. So if you do have this kind of increasing profile, and
That's
it's kind
true.
of consistent with the evidence, right? That more. Oops, who's that? Somebody near the. near
No,
the center.
that's entirely true.
So
That's
in
true.
other words,
There, you'd see
that more
fertility.
Families with higher,
Yeah,
with higher
there'd be
income profiles
fertility
typically
motives.
will have children later, maybe. They get their education later, they marry later, and they have their children later, and they space more.
Does that mean my time is up?
No, keep talking. Don't talk more about the uncertainty. Go ahead.
One thing I didn't say with the information. So you mentioned the siblings. I didn't say the siblings. One would expect with all these information stories that later siblings should do better. If parents learn anything by spending years with their kids.
It's the optimal stopping. I mean, you have a lucky draw first.
Yeah, but people have accounted for that kind of stuff in sort of the birth order effects. Ronnie Pavon's got some nice stuff on that recently, trying to do that.
And
I mean,
the older
so
sibling can
you may say I
also
don't
raise
believe
the
the
numbers,
result,
right?
empirical result. You may say I don't believe Shell's work. I think,
No, but if you
but
upstate on the kid, you just stop. You have a lucky draw, and then you think it's good to have another kid. You have another kid, and turns out to get the average kid, and so we get this birth order effect just from an optimal stop.
yeah, but I think people have shown that the birth order effect you can account for that, and you still get birth order effects.
I don't know how you account for that.
Pavon's done some work. Read his recent paper. I forget how he does it, to be honest, too.
I understand your birth order effect. The second, the resource constraint. I mean, as long as you can save it.
All I'm saying, so there's okay. So you may want to quibble with the empirical result. That's I think people have tried to deal with that problem and have done a decent job of it. So if you don't, then the color of this doesn't matter. But then you might want to not turn this red. But I think the model you would generally expect that people would learn from their first kid. And they find, and you even think in some sense the further apart they are, the more they might actually learn something. Like I get to see what I did the first few years, and my kid either turns out pretty good or it turns out to be a mess. And I talk to other parents, and they say, "Well, you should have been doing this all the way along." So you would expect it. I mean, in general, with this, I think it's very hard to come up with a story where this model would generate better first children than second children for an information. What's that?
You learn about whether you should have another kid. I'm having a lucky draw.
Yeah, so you could have a fertility effect.
Yeah. So that gives you.
Yeah, you could have a fertility effect. No, but I think people try to deal with that, and I don't remember off the top of my head now how they there's different people who try to use sort of whether your birth order of your maybe do you guys do that with the gender of your children, etc. But Ronnie does something else. I can't remember what he does, but he makes the point that that's one of his main contributions, and I've just forgotten. It's been a while since I looked at it.
Can you go through the
what he
birth order
does.
effects for the credit constraints?
What's that?
The birth order effects for the credit constraints.
Yeah, so that was just what I was saying is,
I didn't get the green part. If you can save, I mean, that shouldn't be the... Maybe I'm slower, but if I can save, that's not...
if I can't borrow,
No, but I mean, I can always... So you own the child for a while. Why should I overinvest in I can always save that money.
no, it's just you come along, you're second, and now you got to compete with your parents' time and resources with the first kid. Whereas the
People
first
have
kid
also
didn't
made
have
a
to do
second-
that.
But then you
On a positive notion, the second kid has some benefit of being the teacher to the first kid.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah. So that's why I say I don't want to say one is. I think the models it doesn't. I think you need a much richer. You need to sort of model that process to think more about this. Let me just conclude here, which is this is sort of my summary of the different models and whether they can explain different facts. And the first thing I want to say right off the bat is one should not conclude from the color, the relative color of these, which is most important or least important. In some sense, ability correlation is really quite important. But it is also the fact that it cannot explain a lot of different things. So if you want to understand some of these factors, just sort of having parents and kids' ability correlated is not going to help you solve those problems. If you just want to understand the raw correlation in income between parents and income and kids' outcomes, this is probably a big part of it. But trying to understand sort of a number of other sort of features of the data, it's not very helpful for. And that's sort of my summary. So you can see under the credit constraints, I put a neutral result on the birth order because I think there's sort of more tests. The model and thinking about it starts to tell you what things you might look for, but I haven't seen that looked for in the data. But let me end there. I'm sure over time.
Thank you.
Thanks.